to it. There's a 70% chance NATO and Russia will go to war. A scholar tells a journalist that he sees a 70% chance of combat between NATO and Russia following the incident in the Kerch Strait that's being fueled by Russiagate. Now, they're having a big problem about access to a Russian sea, the Sea of Azov. And there's an interview I need to check out here. Mr. Zamrili is a Hungarian-born scholar and a research fellow. Let's go into the CPU defend for now. Turn down the volume. So we spoke to him about escalating hostilities on Russia's Ukrainian and Black Sea borders, and about an exercise, NATO exercise, Trident Juncture. They had massive military exercise on the Russian borders, which ended just as the latest hostilities began. The hostilities between Ukraine, NATO and Russia continue to escalate in the Sea of Azov, that's a Russian sea, the Kerch Strait, which is the access to that sea, and the Black Sea, that's a sea that's being connected by the Kerch Strait, and the Black Sea leads to Turkey, and that's the only way to get to the Mediterranean. So this guy's been asked, what do you think the latest odds of a shooting war between NATO and Russia are? If one hasn't started by the time this is published. Okay, it's been published, hasn't started yet. Several weeks ago, this guy said it was 60%. Now he'd say maybe 70%. The problem is that Trump seems determined to be the anti-Obama. So, for instance, Obama made a deal with the Iranians. Trump broke the deal. He's determined to do everything on the opposite side of what Obama would do. And that would mean we going to have more involvement in the Ukraine, because Obama didn't really try to send any heavy weapons into the Ukraine. But there's a General Scaparotti. He's been on the phone with the Ukrainian the Ukrainian president, offering his full support. This is bad news. This guy says, there's been a proxy war between inside Ukraine since 2014, with NATO backing Poroshenko's Ukrainian government. He's a Nazi. And Russia backing the dissidents and armed separatists who speak Russian and identify as Russian in Ukraine's southeastern regions. Yeah, they're not supposed to be there anyway, but that happened during the Soviet region, so yeah, they're going to have to draw a new border. But in the Kerch Strait, the hostilities are between Russia and Ukraine, with NATO behind Ukraine. We actually sold them a couple of ships. So I'm figuring Vladimir Putin is not happy about any of this. But we keep calling his bluff, and there's going to be a time when he's going to say, okay, you want to call my bluff? A shooting war will begin if it escalates to where NATO soldiers shoot and kill Russian soldiers, or vice versa. Whoever shoots first, the other side will feel compelled to respond, and then there'll be a war between Russia and NATO, or Russia and a NATO nation. Now, Ukraine is not part of NATO. They shouldn't be a part of NATO. They shouldn't be at the IMF, International Monetary Fund, because they're in a war. But it sure looks like we're sending them weapons. So we don't know whether NATO would feel compelled to respond as one of its Russians fired on soldiers of individual NATO nations. Most likely UK soldiers, since the UK is sending more of its special forces and already has the largest NATO military presence in the Ukraine. Russia could defeat the UK, but if the US gets involved, all bets are off. They would start fighting a conventional war, with tanks and guns, until one or the other was going to be under threat to be overrun, and then they'd switch to tactical nuclear weapons, which would then switch over to real strategic nuclear weapons. It's hard to imagine that the US would allow Russia to defeat the UK. Yeah, there's something like a special relationship between those two countries. But if push comes to shove, maybe they will abandon the UK and let them be destroyed. On the other hand, the US is the US and the UK is the UK. The US might well be ready to fight to the last Brit. That's funny. They're ready to fight with other countries' soldiers. There are already 300 US paratroopers in the Ukraine training Ukrainians. But the British would be well advised that words of encouragement from Washington don't necessarily translate into US willingness to go to war. The US Congress passed a law that US troops can't serve on any foreign command, so that will require a US command. Yes, and without that, any British military defeat could be blamed on traditional British military incompetence, rather than US weakness or foolish braggadocio. Oh, that's hard. Bragging. Bragging is what he's trying to say here. This latest dust-up between the Russian and Ukrainian navies took place in the Kerch Strait. I had to study several maps to understand this, but basically, neither Russian nor Ukrainian vessels, military or commercial, can get to or from the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea without passing through that strait. That doesn't mean that neither could get to the Black Sea, because both have Black Sea borders, but they couldn't get from ports in the Sea of Azov to the Black Sea and back. And neither Ukraine nor Russia can get from the Black Sea to the Western European waters without passing through the Bosporus and Dardanelles Strait in Turkey, so they can get to the Mediterranean, and then to the Atlantic, through the Strait of Gibraltar, which is bordered on one side by Spain and the British territory of Gibraltar, and the other by Morocco and the Spanish territory. So that's a lot of NATO countries right there. So if there are any geostrategic choke points where the Russian ships, naval or commercial, could be stopped by NATO or their allies, and Ukraine has already asked Turkey to stop them from passing to Turkey, what are our thoughts on that? Well, he says, of course, Ukraine can ask for anything it's like. There's no way in the world Turkey would try to stop Russian ships going through the Bosporus Strait. That would be a violation of the Montreux Convention and an act of war on the part of Turkey. Now, we need to kick Turkey out of NATO yesterday. But we need that airbase. As for the Kerch Strait, it is Russian territorial waters. Ukraine is free to use it and has been doing so. The only thing the Russians insist on is that any ship going through uses a Russian pilot. During a recent incident, the Ukrainian tug refused to use a Russian pilot. The Russians became suspicious, fearing that the Ukrainians were engaged in sabotage to blow up the bridge, which links Crimea to Russia. It's very important that they do that, otherwise there's no land connection between Russia and Crimea, and they might as well give it back. This is why the Russians are accusing Kiev of staging a provocation. There's a long withstanding back channel between the White House and the Kremlin. And anti-Trump fanatics keep claiming that is a new and traitorous, but it's a long-established tradition where they have a hotline between the Kremlin and the White House. Why? Well, Obama and Putin use it to keep Russian and US soldiers from firing on one another, instead of the jihadis both claim to be fighting in Syria. That's a good one. They're saying they're fighting the terrorists, but they're fighting each other. So basically you have two hot spots where a hot war could start. Three, actually. That would be the South China Sea between the US and China, Syria between the US and Russia, and the Ukraine between Russia and the US. Kennedy and Khrushchev used it to keep the Bay of Pigs crisis from escalating into a nuclear war. That was the most heavy crisis ever, 1962. The Russians, the Soviets, put nuclear weapons on Cuban soil, which is right next to America. It's a very good analogy. Ukraine is like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but then switched around, where the Americans are deploying forces right on the border with Russia. And I can imagine they're not very happy. Shouldn't Trump and Putin be talking now through that back channel, no matter how much it upsets the mainstream media, like CNN and MSNBC? I used to watch a lot of CNN earlier, and a lot of MSNBC, because I'm kind of left-leaning. I tend to be progressive. It's because I'm educated and Dutch, that's why. But I don't like those channels anymore. They're all part of military-industrial complex. Not trustworthy. And they're dying. People like Alex Jones, Joe Rogan, that's where the news is at. So this guy says about this back channel, should they be talking? He says, well, of course they should. The danger is that in this atmosphere of anti-Russian hysteria, such channels for dialogue may not be kept open. Hey, hang on. Alright, I had to take a little meeting there. Okay, about this back channel, the danger is that in this atmosphere of anti-Russian hysteria, such channels for dialogue may not be kept open. As a result, crisis would escalate beyond the point at which either side could back down without losing face. What's terrifying is that so many US politicians and press now describe any kind of negotiation, dialogue, or threat management as treasonous collusion by Donald Trump. Which I think that's not really right. That's called diplomacy. Congress can make war, the president can make peace. Remember Trump's first bombing in Syria, April 2017. Before he launched that attack, his administration gave advance warning to the Russians to enable them to get any Russian aircraft out of harm's way. This perfectly sensible action on the part of the administration was greeted by Hillary Clinton and MSNBC as evidence that the whole operation was cooked up by Trump and Putin to take attention off Russiagate. It's nuts. So he says, most of us have heard Russia and NATO's conflicting accounts on why the Russian Navy seized several Ukrainian vessels in the Sea of Azov. What's your interpretation of what happened? This guy says, like he said, I think the Russians had every right to be suspicious of the intent of the Ukrainian vessels. They know that these Russian territorial waters, they know that the only way to go through the Kerch Strait is by making use of a Russian pilot. They refused to allow the Russians to pilot the ships through the strait. Whatever the intent was, whether it was to carry out sabotage, to provoke the Russians into overreacting and then to demand help from NATO, or simply to go through the strait without a Russian pilot in order to claim that the strait was not Russian. So whatever the intent, the Russians were entitled to respond. The force the Russians used was hardly excessive. In similar circumstances, the US would have destroyed all of the ships and killed everyone. Now we need to recall, incidentally, that Israel has seized the Gaza flotilla, full of Turkish guys, intent on going to the Gaza port, probably with weapons on it. And the Israelis don't fuck around. They killed about 9 people on that flotilla. So a question here is, don't the US, Ukraine and the United Nations Security Council refuse to recognize the Kerch Strait as Russian territory and insist that Russia's claim to it violates several maritime treaties? Okay, he says, according to the 2003 agreement, Russia and Ukraine agreed to consider the strait as well as the Sea of Azov as a shared territorial waters. From 2014 on, Russia considered the strait as Russian waters, though it's made no attempt to hamper Ukrainian shipping. Sea of Azov is still shared by Russia and the Ukraine. During the recent incident, the Ukrainian Navy acted provocatively, deliberately challenging the Russians. As for what US Navy accepts, how would NATO respond to if Serbia entered Kosovo on some pretext or other? Good point. Okay, now let's go back to NATO's exercise Trident Juncture, a massive military exercise on Scandinavian Arctic borders that concluded November 24th, one day before the Kerch Strait incident. First phase was deployment from August to October. Second phase was war games from October to November 7th. The war games were based on the premise that Russia had invaded Scandinavia by ground, air and sea. They included 50,000 participants from 31 NATO and partner countries. Yeah, I went on, hey, welcome to the show, drop a comment. I went off on this story about how we had Dutch Marines over in Norway and they didn't have any warm clothes. So we gave them €1,000 to buy their own warm clothes. And that's why I started imagining Dutch Marines in the Norwegian mountains wearing these bright colored ski clothes. Anyway, it's on now. It's a big problem there in the Kerch Strait between Ukraine and Russia. 3 global hotspots where a hot war could start at any moment. It's the South China Sea between the US and China. It's Syria between the US and Russia, and it's Ukraine between NATO and Russia. So this exercise included 50,000 soldiers, 250 aircraft, 65 naval vessels, and up to 10,000 tanks and other ground vehicles. And I hate to think how much fossil fuel they burned. That's hilarious. That's a really good one. Let's go to the comments. Let me start up my browser, guys. I'll be right with you. The final phase of that exercise was a command post exercise to make sure that should NATO forces ever face a real Russian invasion of Scandinavia, the response could be safely coordinated in Norway and in Italy, far from the war zone. So the question to this guy is, do Scandinavians have reason to worry that Russia might invade any of their respective nations? I guess his answer will be no. Let's see what he says. Not at all. This is ridiculous. It was the largest military exercise since the end of the Cold War. And why? Why did they do this? Russia isn't threatening Scandinavia, but it's more likely that it will if NATO continues to conduct war games on its borders. Right now, tension between East and West is escalating so fast that a single event could be like a match that triggers an explosion, and then there will be war. Question to this scholar, he's a pretty clever guy. There was a recent Russian exercise, or joint Russian and Chinese exercise, based on the premise that the US had invaded Korea, right? So yeah, that's what his shoe is on the other foot. He says, right, but it wasn't anywhere near Europe, so it wasn't threatening the Europeans. It took place in eastern Siberia, so it shouldn't have caused panic in NATO countries. It shouldn't have caused panic in the US either, because the Pacific Ocean separates the US and the Koreans. That would be a fourth hotspot, but we kind of pulled the stinger out of that one. Let's go to the channel. I'll give you the short version. Has Russia ever attempted to seize territory outside of its own borders since the end of the Cold War? He says no, Russia never attempted to seize territory outside its own borders. The case cited by the West is Crimea, but that was really an outstanding issue that should have been addressed during the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin, the drunken, incompetent stooge that the US installed, just neglected it. It's a matter of opinion. Khrushchev gave Crimea to the Ukrainians in a poker match. I'm not kidding you. There was like a poker match, a card game, and Khrushchev, he gave the Ukrainians Crimea. The problem there is there's a civil war in Ukraine, and in that civil war the Russians were no longer allowed to use military bases in Crimea, which was agreed to. Let's go to the comments. So he's half right there. Crimea has been a part of Russia for more than 200 years. For most of the time during the Soviet era, it was an autonomous republic within the Russian Federation. Here it is. In 1954, Khrushchev transferred some degree of sovereignty over the Crimean Republic to Ukraine. I'm not entirely sure why he did that, but the issue wasn't that important because Ukraine was then Soviet. Dude, this is a long-ass article. Last question. NATO practiced war with Russia. What's the question? The US has military bases all over the world. Does Russia have a right to do anything remotely like it? No, Russia does not have any military bases outside its borders, which are now more or less as they were in 1939, when they were surrounded by hostile states that were more than happy to join Hitler. Yeah, this guy's absolutely right. Hitler didn't want any Ukrainians in his army because he thought they were subhuman. If Hitler had allowed Ukrainians in his army, they would have defeated Russia. So don't worry about our troops and war games all over your borders, because we don't really mean any harm. Which is, yeah, I can get that. Let's go to the comments. Hey, Creek. Can meet more Dutch people in there. Yeah, man. If you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. That's the saying. So, last week NATO accused the Russian military of jamming its signals during its rehearsal for a war on Russia's borders. Yes, that's what the US considers Russian aggression, even though its troops and bases are all over the world and all over Russia's borders. Okay, something about a gas line, blah 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 blah. Anything else you'd like to say for now? He says, I think it's amazing that this many years after the Cold War we've reached a point where there's almost no public criticism of a policy that has led to the US abandoning any major arms control agreement. Yeah. Okay, the last thing I'm going to say about this is something called the Monroe Doctrine. This is about 100 years old, and the Americans decided that anything in the Western Hemisphere, so anything to do with the Americas, South America or North America, that not a single country would be allowed to be in those areas. They would not allow Soviet bases in Cuba. They would not allow Soviet people in Brazil. That entire piece of real estate, the Western Hemisphere, they say that's America's domain. So why isn't that mirrored on the other side? Why is America fucking around, excuse me for the French, in the Eastern Hemisphere? It's a bit lopsided. And my point on this, and it is pretty subversive, is that we should kick Turkey out of NATO, and we should kick England out of NATO. And maybe we should kick America out of NATO, because they're not behaving. And that's all I got to say about that. Alright, I got a comment from... Yeah, damn. I attacked Raba's base yesterday. Or the day before. I'm gonna wait and see if he posts a video of his retaliation. So, my vets are all good. I think I'm gonna do one for old time's sake. Let's bring in an attack. Yeah. I'm definitely going to check out the speed perks. I deployed about 10,000 assault guys and now I have speed perks all over the place. Let's switch them back from a defensive posture to an offensive posture. Take out the... Switch out rapid deployment. Now this guy, he likes to elbow his way into going to the front. I'm still giving him a speed perk. No, I'm not. Take it away. He somehow finds his way back to the front anyway. So I could give him the fire rate or the rapid deployment. It's going to be rapid deployment for this guy. And the commando gets the fastest because he's one of the slowest units. Take away the fire rate, put in the black speed, and I don't need to fast track any more colonels. That's finally done. Let's get a good opponent, go out with a bang. Let's see, 10,000, 10,000. Bombardier. This is easier. Alright, let's go full bore. Lots of ammo. 4 focus fires. I don't need to put any more tactical boots on my troops because I have the speed perk. So that was my little rant on potential hotspots in Korea, Syria, Ukraine. Who am I forgetting here? South China Sea. There's a good chance that China might invade Taiwan. I wouldn't mind. I mean, it's just nationalists. They fought a war 70 years ago. And these guys are still in a little island off China. China's not happy. Well, it's kind of their border. Just like Syria is not next to America. America. Ukraine isn't next to America. It's next to Russia. Korea isn't next to America, it's next to China and Russia. And the official policy of the US, this is literally what they said. Their State Department policy is, "We're America, bitch." That's what they say. That's what, I don't know if they say it, it would be bad diplomacy, but it's basically how they go about it. Jeez. But yeah, the real worry is that because Obama didn't send lethal weapons into the Ukraine, and Trump wants to be the anti-Obama, you know, we could have a problem. Let's focus on this guy. Right. Okay, I need to get my troops in a row. I don't have enough. I'm already out of munitions. Why? I brought munitions. Oh, and I can't deploy these guys either. Right. I did not transfer my veterans into a offensive posture. This is not going to go well. In fact, I think I already lost the match. Wow. Way to go, Kravens. Timing is of the essence. Don't let them shoot. don't have the mass. Damn! This is horrible. And I'm not deploying any veterans. It took way too long to train them. Nope, not even a miracle can save me now. Maybe if I'd waited a bit longer. Let's give this a shot. Wait for it. Three, 5. Damn. I think I'm about 90% over that cold. I've been playing guns up for 2 days straight. I'm definitely getting the guns up fatigue. I'm dying to finish Grand Theft Auto. Not literally, figuratively. And now I have the winter sun in my face. The winter sun is always a bit lower on the horizon. It's a great story. We used to worship the sun, and about December 24th, the sun would go lower and lower and lower, December 21st, and they were afraid that the sun would not come back. And once it started to come back, they would say the God has returned and has been reborn. Which is why we have Christmas on December 24th. There you go, another little rant. I'm so done. I'm gonna play something else. Thanks for watching. Later.